I woke up expecting a quiet, cozy winter morning. You know the kind. Frost on the windows, coffee in hand, and a warm fire crackling in the fireplace. But instead of tossing a fresh log onto the flames, I stepped outside to find my entire firewood pile gone. Not a single piece left. Just an empty spot where I had neatly stacked it the day before. At first, I stood there, half asleep, trying to make sense of it. Had I miscalculated how much I had? Maybe I burned through more than I thought? But no, that wasn't possible. I had just restocked. I remembered the ache in my back from hauling those heavy logs. I had spent nearly an hour stacking them perfectly against the side of my house. There was no way I had burned through an entire pile overnight. That's when a weird feeling crept in. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't me being forgetful. Someone had taken it. But who would steal firewood? It's not like I live in some medieval village where people have to sneak out at night to keep their hearths going. I looked around my yard, searching for any clues, footprints, tire tracks, anything. But the fresh snowfall had already covered any signs of who did it. The only thing I knew for sure? Someone had stolen from me. And I had a feeling this wasn't just some random thief. I wasn't about to let this slide. If someone had the nerve to steal from me, I wanted to know who. So I marched back inside, sat down at my desk, and pulled up the security camera footage. At first, I half expected to see some wild animal, maybe a raccoon with an overachieving attitude or a bear getting ready for hibernation. Or maybe it was just some random thief sneaking in during the night. But as soon as the video loaded, I realized I had underestimated just how ridiculous this was about to be, because there she was, Karen. If you've ever dealt with an HOA, you know a Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, the kind of person who acts like every blade of grass is her personal concern. She doesn't just enforce the rules, she is the rules. And if something doesn't meet her impossibly high standards, well, she'll fix that, whether you like it or not. And in broad daylight, as if she had every right in the world, Karen strolled right up to my firewood pile with 2 hired movers in tow. She wasn't even trying to be sneaky. No hesitation, no second guessing, just pure entitlement. I watched as she waved her hands around like some kind of HOA general, barking orders while the movers loaded my firewood into the back of a pickup truck. And the whole time, that smug look on her face, like she was doing me a favor, like she genuinely believed that my firewood somehow belonged to her. She didn't leave a note, didn't send a message. She didn't even look around to make sure no one was watching, because in her mind, she didn't have to. She had just decided, on her own, that my firewood was now hers. I wasn't about to let this go. Karen had stolen from me in broad daylight, and now she was going to answer for it. So, fueled by frustration, and maybe a little too much caffeine, I stormed down the street straight to her house. Now, Karen's house wasn't just a house, it was the house. The kind that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a real estate brochure. The lawn? Perfectly trimmed, not a single leaf out of place. The mailbox? So polished it probably blinded people on sunny days. And of course there was the oversized American flag display, not because she was particularly patriotic, but because it made her house look like some kind of HOA headquarters. I barely had to knock before the door swung open. She was expecting me. Karen stood there, arms crossed, already looking irritated, as if I was inconveniencing her, like I was the problem here. "Jake," she said, forcing a fake smile. "What a surprise. What can I do for you?" I didn't waste time. "You can start by explaining why you stole my firewood." She let out a dramatic sigh, shaking her head like a disappointed schoolteacher. "Stole?" "Oh, Jake, that's such a strong word. I merely repurposed it for the good of the community." I stared at her. Repurposed it? She nodded, as if this was the most reasonable thing in the world. Yes. Your firewood was stacked in a way that, frankly, did not match the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. I blinked. Aesthetic harmony? Karen, it was in my backyard. No one could even see it. She waved a hand dismissively. That's not the point. Then, with a smug little smirk, she added, Besides, the HOA bonfire is coming up, and we needed extra wood. Yours was the closest and most convenient. I let out a humorless laugh. So you just took it? Oh, Jake, she sighed again, now sounding genuinely bored. Don't be so dramatic. It's just firewood. You can always get more. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. Karen had a gift, the ability to make people feel like they were the crazy ones, like they were overreacting, even when she was blatantly in the wrong. It was gaslighting at its finest. But as much as she tried to make me feel unreasonable, I wasn't falling for it. Because standing there, looking at her smug little face, I already knew exactly what I was going to do next. Standing on Karen's porch, listening to her talk like she hadn't just straight up stolen from me, I had a moment of clarity. She wasn't going to give the firewood back. She didn't feel guilty. She didn't care. In her mind, this was already over. But if Karen thought she could take from me without consequences, she was dead wrong. That's when the idea hit me. A slow, devious grin spread across my face as I realized. Fine, Karen. You want my firewood? You can have it. The plan first. I needed logs, just a few. They didn't have to be big, just enough to blend in with whatever pile she still had left from her little community service project. So I went out, gathered some old firewood, and got to work. The key part? Hollowing them out. It took time, patience, and a good set of tools, but I carefully carved out the centers, making sure to keep the outer layer intact. To anyone else, these logs looked perfectly normal. But inside? That's where the magic happened. Fire ants. Tiny, aggressive, highly motivated to ruin Karen's day. I introduced a small colony into each log, sealing them inside just enough to keep them contained, but not enough to suffocate them. The real trick was making sure they wouldn't come out until the logs were burning. Heat activates them, wakes them up, and sends them swarming. So the second these logs hit the flames, Karen and her perfect little bonfire were in for a nasty surprise. The setup. I wasn't about to just hand them over. That would be too obvious. No, Karen needed to think she was getting away with something. So I placed the logs exactly where I knew she'd see them, near the edge of my yard, just close enough to the sidewalk that it would seem like I had carelessly left them there, just waiting to be taken. Then, I stepped back and let nature take its course. Now, all I had to do was wait. The next morning, I was up early, coffee in hand, sitting by the window. I didn't have to wait long. Right on schedule, Karen appeared. She strutted out of her house like she owned the entire neighborhood, her sharp eyes scanning for anything out of place. And then, bingo! She spotted the firewood I had carelessly left near the edge of my yard. I could see it all play out on her face. First, the classic hands-on-hips stance, like she was personally offended by the existence of something she hadn't yet taken control of. Then, the scowl, the one she wore when she was making a mental list of rules she just invented on the spot. And just like before, she didn't even consider asking. Why would she? In her mind, everything in this neighborhood belonged to her. Karen pulled out her phone, and within minutes, her two favorite minions showed up, the same movers who had stolen my first pile of wood. She pointed at the logs like a queen giving orders to her knights. I couldn't hear them, but I didn't need to. The scene played out like a silent film. One of the guys hesitated for a second, probably wondering if they should be taking more wood from my property. Karen, of course, shut that down immediately with a sharp wave of her hand. No thinking. Just obey. And just like that, they hauled off the booby-trapped firewood, straight into Karen's backyard. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. She had no idea what was coming. The HOA bonfire was in full swing. Neighbors gathered around, bundled in coats and scarves, chatting over cups of cider. Kids ran around with sticks, already roasting marshmallows. The air smelled like burning wood and cinnamon, the kind of cozy atmosphere that made you forget for a second that this whole thing was organized by the most entitled person in the neighborhood. Karen, of course, was in her element. She stood in front of the fire pit, soaking in the attention like some kind of small-town politician. She had that smug, self-important look on her face as she raised her hands for silence. And then came the speech. "Neighbors," she began, in the tone of someone who thought they were way more important than they actually were. "It's moments like these that remind us why we come together as a community. And of course, none of this would be possible without a little extra generosity." I almost laughed. "A little extra generosity? You mean stealing?" Karen didn't waste another second before making a dramatic show of grabbing a log. I recognized it immediately, one of mine. "For the community," she declared, tossing it onto the fire. The wood cracked as the flames took hold. At first, nothing happened. The fire burned normally, sending up the usual plumes of smoke. The crowd clapped politely, already losing interest. But then, a few ants crawled out, then dozens, then thousands. The heat had done exactly what I hoped, forced the fire ants out of their hiding places, sending them swarming in every direction. The first scream came from a woman standing too close to the fire pit, then another from a kid who had been poking the logs with a stick. Within seconds, pure chaos. People swatted at their arms and legs, shaking out their clothes as the tiny, furious insects latched on and bit. The festive, cheerful atmosphere vanished in an instant. And Karen? Oh, Karen got it the worst. The ants crawled up her legs, into her sleeves, under her collar. She shrieked, flailing wildly, trying to brush them off, but it only made it worse. In her panic, she knocked over an entire table of hot cider. The steaming liquid splashed all over her coat, her hair, her face. She yelped in pain, stumbling backward, straight into the marshmallow station. The scene was almost too perfect. Karen, once the proud HOA queen, was now covered in sticky marshmallow goo, drenched in cider, and still being attacked by a swarm of angry fire ants. Neighbors backed away, some horrified, some trying not to laugh. Kids pointed. A few people even pulled out their phones. Karen let out one last dramatic screech before making a break for it. Running straight for the lake, with one final panicked leap, she face-planted into the freezing water, and just like that, the great HOA bonfire was over. I stood at the edge of the chaos, watching as Karen emerged from the lake, shivering, sticky, humiliated. She turned her head toward the firewood pile, then toward me. And that's when I saw it, the moment of realization in her eyes. She knew. She did this to herself. The next morning, the neighborhood was alive with gossip. Word spread fast, and by the time I stepped outside, everyone was already talking about Karen's meltdown at the bonfire. "Did you see her face when she hit the lake? I swear she was foaming at the mouth, like an actual demon. I heard she had to throw out her entire coat. The ants wouldn't let go." But the weirdest part? Karen was silent. No HOA notices in anyone's mailboxes. No passive-aggressive emails about unapproved holiday decorations. No morning patrol, where she usually strutted around pretending to inspect lawns. It was like she had vanished. Then, right when people started thinking she might actually be embarrassed enough to back off for good, an emergency HOA meeting was announced. The email landed in everyone's inboxes with a dramatic, urgent community matters subject line, and of course, it was filled with peak Karen nonsense. She threw around words like gross misconduct and an attack on the community. She painted herself as a victim, claiming the bonfire had been sabotaged by a cruel and calculated act. She even made it sound like she was personally targeted, as if the firewood had somehow been booby-trapped specifically against her. Which, yeah, but that's not the point. She ended the email with a thinly veiled threat, saying that certain individuals who endanger the integrity of the HOA will face serious consequences. Translation: she had no proof it was me, but she was looking for someone to blame. The HOA meeting was packed. Every seat was taken. People were standing along the walls, and the air buzzed with quiet murmurs. This wasn't just about the firewood anymore. This was years of frustration boiling over. Karen took center stage, gripping a stack of papers like she was about to read a courtroom verdict. She cleared her throat dramatically, then launched into her speech. Last night was an act of sabotage, a direct attack on this community. Someone, before she could finish, Barbara, the HOA vice president, cut her off. Karen, before we talk about sabotage, let's discuss the real issue. Why did you steal Jake's firewood? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Karen. Her face twitched. She opened her mouth like she was about to come up with another excuse, but before she could, someone from the back spoke up. Yeah, let's talk about that. And while we're at it, let's talk about the gnome fines. A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd. And the lemonade stands. My daughter cried for 2 hours when you shut hers down. You nearly started a riot over mailbox colors. Karen's face went pale. She was losing control. Then, Barbara did something no one expected. She straightened her papers, looked around the room, and calmly said, I'd like to introduce a motion to remove Karen from her position as HOA president. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Then, one by one, people started raising their hands. First 5, then 10, then nearly everyone. Karen stood there, frozen, speechless, humiliated, defeated, her hands clenched into fists, her lips pressed into a thin line, and without another word, she stormed out. And just like that, she was gone. That night, for the first time in a long time, everything felt right. No HOA emails, no ridiculous fines, no Karen. Just peace. I sat by the fire, the flames crackling as they ate away at the logs. My logs, the ones I actually owned. The warmth felt even better knowing I didn't have to fight for it. A couple of neighbors wandered over, cups of hot cocoa in hand. We weren't exactly close before, but tonight felt different. Lighter. I can't believe she's really gone, one of them said, shaking their head. It's like the whole neighborhood can breathe again. Another neighbor chuckled. It actually feels like a community now. No more walking on eggshells. We sat there for a while, just enjoying the fire and the quiet. No drama, no HOA nonsense, just normal, peaceful living. I reached for another log, tossed it into the flames, and watched as the fire flared up, strong and steady. Here's to justice.